Welcome to How to Study the Bible. Today I'm doing an overview of how to study the Bible and an overview of the Bible itself. This is just reference material and information that you can use as you are studying particular passages. I think it's important to be able to see the big picture and have some basic understanding of what the Bible is, what is contained in the Bible, and an understanding of how the Bible is organized, because it's organized in a very particular way that is instructive and helpful as we're doing our individual study to put in those passages in context. So what is the Bible? Let's begin with that question. And here are just a few summarized points on as we look at the Bible as a library. The Bible is not one book. It is a book of books. In the Protestant Bible, and there are different versions, that the Protestant Bible has 66 books. In the Hebrew scriptures, which is commonly known as the Old Testament, there are 39 books. In the New Testament, there are 27. Those books, that library, collection of books, do have that common thread. And the common thread is that it's got a story, it's God's story in relationship to a particular group of people over a period of time. It's not all people. It is not the fullness of the history of creation and the world. It is not inclusive of all, but it is instructive, I think, beyond those particular relationships. But it's important to recognize that most of the Bible is written in a narrative style, and it's telling stories, and the story is carrying through or following the relationship of God's of God to God's people over a particular period of time and a particular group of people. So again, it's not all God's people. I don't want to suggest in any way that God was only concerned with the people named in those biblical narratives. Then or now, God is concerned with all of God's creation. And creation, in many ways, is our sibling as well. And so there isn't a certain, a hierarchy of peoples. And I think as we get into studying particular passages, we can delve into that more. But understanding that the Bible, in many ways, is a testimony, testament, same root, right, of testimony, but ultimately story that we can enter into, their story to make it our own. The Bible was produced by and for a community of faith, inspired by the Holy Spirit, but written by men, written by human beings. There is some suggestion that there were texts written by women, some of which, none of which really made it into the canon or the set of authorized books that are contained in the Christian scriptures. So it's important to recognize that God used human beings to convey this wholly inspired word. So it's inspired by the Holy Spirit, but God uses people to communicate. And so that means something as we're reading it for ourselves. That means that it was written with the understanding of the human beings who received it. And it may have challenged their understanding, but it would not have gone so far beyond their understanding that it would have been rendered meaningless to them. So for instance, when we look at the creation narratives in Genesis 1 and 2, they were written when there was a particular view of the world and of creation that the narratives provided there. And there are two separate creation narratives. They are not the same. We believe they were written by different authors. They're addressing two different perspectives. But the first one, the one we think of, in, the 7-day one, the sequence of events that are often used, and people who want to look at that in a literal way will say, well, that's the Bible says it, and that's it. But the Bible is written by human beings, and human beings are limited. We're limited in our understanding, and we're limited to the body of knowledge that exists at the time. And so today, perhaps, if it was being written, it would have been written with the advanced knowledge of evolution. But here's the thing. It's not written to be a science book. It's not written to be a scientific explanation. It's written, the Bible ultimately is a theological text. It's a text about God. So we can look to the Bible and gain understanding about a variety of things, but most of all about our relationship to God, God's intentions and purposes for us, God's will and God's way, God's vision for the world, God's nature and character. So that's what we should be looking for. And if we look for that, what we find in the creation narrative, and let's just look at the first one, let's just consider the first one, that 7-day progression, that it was a progression, that there was a beginning. And at the time that the stories was being told to explain, how did the world come to be? How did humanity and all of the other aspects of creation, the flowers and the sky and the earth and the seas and the animals and even the insects, how did they come to be? Well, first of all, one God in a beginning, not a circular understanding of time, where time has no beginning, no end. No, the time is linear, right? That there is a progression of time, that time builds upon itself and moves in one direction. Revolutionary at the time, we take it for granted. The idea of there being one God, not a pantheon of gods who were in some ways competing against one another, that creation was good. Like we hear that and we take, again, we've heard it before. We think, okay, we might dispute some of those things. Well, is everything good? But the idea that there was a God who created not in competition with other gods, not in manipulation in order to manipulate creation, but a God who created because that's what God does. God creates. And that creation, God said is good. Not depraved, not unworthy, not to be manipulated, that creation for its own sake is good, and all of creation out of its essence has value and worth. Revolutionary, countercultural at the time, some ways countercultural now. We're not looking at it from a scientific perspective or even historical one, but theological perspective. But what's interesting to me that when you compare you compare in broad terms that first creation narrative, the 7-day one, with a broad understanding of evolution, and the Big Bang theory and beyond, is that they're common themes. There's a beginning, there's a progression. Creation builds upon itself. And it's ordered. But the ultimate thing as a Christian that I take away is that however it began, doesn't really matter to me, but I believe that God did it. That it's not random, it's intentional, and God has said, good. And there are other lessons in there too about rest and things like that. But just one example of how you can look at and how our understanding that this text is not, wasn't given on high to be, wasn't dictated, right? It was shared through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but ultimately crafted, written by human beings who are trying to convey something. Let me go to the next point then. The Bible reflects the cultural norms and worldview of its own time and place. So it wasn't written to anyone in our time. It was written thousands of years ago. The last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, to be written, was written over 2,000 years ago. The most recent was 2,000 years ago. So it's written over a period of time with a very culture very different from ours, with worldviews different from ours. Those worldviews were also shifting. You can see the shift as you walk through the journey of that people over time. And we're talking primarily about the Hebrew people. We see even how some of their worldview shaped, but their worldview, their cultural norms were different than ours. And so some of the things that we see in there are descriptive, not prescriptive. So what do I mean by that? When you're telling the story of what happened, that doesn't necessarily mean that's a value judgment. This is the way it's supposed to be. And in fact, when you read passages in context, you'll find that some of the passages that people will take out and isolate from in the Bible to make their own points, will find that the context actually will shape our understanding in a completely different way. But we could talk about that in individual studies. Just understand that we need, in some ways, as much as we can, the information available to us, and there's a lot of information available to us, enter into and understand those cultural norms and the worldview of the writers, the biblical writers, of the people who are experiencing these events, so we can enter the story not from our perspective, but first from their perspective, so we can hear and understand it in the way that the original audience would have heard and understood the text. The Bible writers were influenced by a variety of theological viewpoints and were intentional in their writings. They had an audience. They had a point to convey. Just like writers of any book, you don't write anything or you don't craft a message without trying to get some point across, even if it is in a narrative form. Even if you're telling a story about relationships, about two people or groups of people, if you're writing poetry, wisdom sayings, even the law, there's a point of view. There's something to be conveyed. There's an intent. They're trying to communicate something, and most writers will tell you at some point what they're trying to say. And if they don't tell you explicitly, there's ways for us to understand their point of view, in part by the type of writing it is, the location of the writing, and by that I mean in the history of that people, in the progression of the life of that people, and the audience to whom they first presented, who first would have received this message. The Bible has been translated from its original languages to too many languages to count. There are instances of the Bible being of languages being written for the first time, just so that the Bible can be translated in a form that people will have. That's how extensive the translation has taken. The original language of the Hebrew scriptures, Hebrew, and of the New Testament, primarily Greek, with some Aramaic, which would have been the spoken language at the time. The Bible, the New Testament was written during the time of the Roman Empire, and sometimes people wonder, well, why wasn't it written in Latin? Latin was a scholarly language that was not widely understood then. So part of the reason why it's primarily a dead language now, except as a scholarly language, right? A language that people learn because it helps them in a particular scholarly, reading the classics in their original form and things of that nature. Some of the disciplines, for instance, like medicine, where people will learn Latin because the Latin is the root of so many of the terms. Latin, if you are interested in languages, is the root of all the so-called Romance languages. And so you'll find that learning Latin will help you to learn Spanish and French and so on. But the Bible is not originally translated into Latin. Latin was one of the first languages it was translated into, but it was not one of the original languages because it wasn't the common language in the Roman Empire. Greek was widely used throughout the empire. Of course, we know from our world history, the Roman Empire took over conquered the Greek Empire and overtook much of the same territory. And so Greek was still widely in circulation as a language. And so most of the New Testament is in Greek. There's a little bit of Aramaic as the common spoken language, particularly of Jesus and his disciples. So from that, we know that there are two primary languages being used here, and languages reflect culture. Languages reflect perspective, worldview, and also reflect sort of our place in history. Our languages evolved. If you try to read something in English from a few hundred years ago, you'll feel like you need a translator because language evolves. Think about the traditional King James version with the these and thous and ye and yeas, the words that we do not use in language, in the English language anymore, because that's what happens. Over time, words enter into and drop off of language. And so even with that, there's a need for an updating and an interpretation for today. Moving from one language to another, you have to translate it, but language is not word for word because language reflects culture, reflects time, reflects the circumstances of our and condition of our lives. And so all translations then require some degree of interpretation. And as we look at the various translations available just in English of the Bible, too many to count and name here, those decisions around translation and interpretation primarily fall in two camps. One is sort of a close following of the original language, word for word as much as possible in translation. Even if that means that the English version or the translated version is a little choppy or witty in nature, isn't quite as fluid and doesn't flow, is not poetic, it can be a little choppier. So like the American Standard Version, real word for word, real choppy to read because it's right there on this end of the pendulum for word. And then the other camp is focusing on translating and capturing the meaning in today's terms and in the language spoken today. You think of Living Bible, the New Living Translation. The Message is an interesting case because the Message is in a translation, it's a paraphrase. And so it intentionally is putting it in the colloquial language of the time. What's interesting to me is as I read the Message, if I go to the Message now, which was only paraphrased a few decades ago, to make it so much more accessible, it feels dated. It feels like I can read it because I was part of the culture of the time that it was written, even though I was young, and I was certainly young in that time, but I can understand the references, the common references that they provide, but it feels a little dated. And I feel like if I handed it to my niece, who is a young woman, she would have to say, well, what does that mean? Because again, language reflects culture. And particularly when you go into idioms and colloquialisms and just references to things at the moment, if you're not part of that, then it requires some further translation. So a lot of, in terms of recommendation, find some place that balances those two well in terms of studying the Bible. Now, I don't recommend one that is here so far on the current, putting it in today's terms. So, make it as most accessible in terms of meaning as your only source to use in studying the Bible. Now, you can get away with that if you are using a study Bible, which I do recommend study Bibles, that will share with you the nuance of words that have been, in some cases, simplified or changed for the sake of a smoother read. In some cases, with those texts, with those translations, I wouldn't recommend using that alone. You can use them, but maybe use them in conversation with one that's on the further end of the on the other side of the pendulum, with more of a word for word. But if you find those that are that are more balanced, like the New Revised Standard Version, which a lot of biblical scholars will use that, sort of the translated version the biblical scholars often use, because it has a really strong, it's a little more word for word, but it's also readable. It's not as readable as, for instance, like the New International Version, the most popular English version of the Bible in the world. It is a little easier to read. You won't find some of the words you find in the New Revised Standard Version, but they're pretty close. And so either of those two, I believe, if you want to use them as your primary Bible for Bible study, either by themselves or in combination with another Bible, you can't really go wrong as an individual studying with either one of those. Even with those, I recommend a study Bible because it gives you a little more of the detail that you'll want to know in terms of the context and authorial intent and when it was written. Some of those details, even a non-study Bible may have a summary before each book that will give you some of that information, but a study Bible will have footnotes throughout, and not a lot, but it will have just enough so it can help you fill out some of the gaps in our understanding and completing the picture. So just understand that that piece of interpretation is there. But one of the wonderful things about that and all of this together is that the Bible invites us into this journey of interpreting and applying it for ourselves. Interpreting not only, in terms of the language, we don't have to do that. Now, real Bible scholars, they do that, and some pastors will as well. I studied both Hebrew and Greek, and I've done translations of the Bible. I do not translate on a week-to-week basis, but I understand enough about the language to understand the importance of certain word choices and understanding enough of the culture to understand when I'm reading, for instance, a commentary, which is a resource that gives you even more in-depth look at a passage. It might go verse by verse, and it might have a comment on each one and might give you details about the translation choices. Average person does not need to go that far. But there are commentaries where you can get a commentary that for the entire New Testament, for example, or for the entire Bible. So it might be one or two volumes. So you're not necessarily getting into that much detail, but enough to really immerse yourself. And you want to take Bible study to another level without getting too far into the weeds. That's one way to go. But it invites us into the story. So when we do this work, what it allows us to do is enter into that story of God's relationship to particular people from their perspective, so we can understand how they would have heard it. So then we can make it our story, authentically make it our story, truthfully make it our story, not from our own perspective, but an informed perspective that really reveals the truth given to us through studying the Bible and the inspired word from God. So understanding that, I just want to run through the books in this book of books. The Old Testament are Hebrew scriptures, and the New Testament. The difference between the two, the Old Testament is before the birth of Jesus. In fact, the last book of the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures written centuries before the birth of Jesus. And then the New Testament, which is the life and ministry of Jesus and his disciples until the end of the first century, loosely is the time frame here. And so even within those two divisions, there's organization. And the organization is grouped in that order, loosely chronological, but not completely. There is, particularly with the Hebrew scriptures, and there's significant overlap in the content. And when I say overlap, I mean in terms of the same individuals, the same things going on historically, but written from different perspectives. And I'll make that clear in a moment. So you begin with, in the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And Pentateuch is a Greek word that means 5 books. real fancy there. Torah is Hebrew for law. We share, of course, the Hebrew scriptures with our Jewish siblings, and we actually share our scriptures with our Muslim siblings as well. Different perspectives. We read these texts with different lens, but we do share them. And I think that's important to understand. So the first 5 books, we begin with the Genesis, and Genesis is telling the story of the beginning, the origins of this people, right? And Genesis starts really broad with creation and then narrows in on a family, a dynasty that then becomes bigger. It's narrative in nature, as is Exodus, but Exodus picks up with the birth of Moses. And it tells that story, that journey from captivity to the promised land. And what's interesting is that the other 3 books in the Pentateuch, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, tell that same story as Exodus from different perspectives, different details. But it's, in terms of the time frame, it's all overlapping. Leviticus is sharing the laws handed down to Moses. So if you want to read all the laws, hundreds of laws that were given, they're in Leviticus. But one of the nice things about reading them from that perspective, if you read them carefully, you'll notice a trend that yes, God gives these prescriptions, commands, laws for maintaining right relationship with God, with one another, and with yourself, in terms of like the dietary laws, the health laws. But there's always a means of making things right. There's always a way to, if you fall short, there's a means of grace, even in the Levitical laws. It's also interesting that laws don't come into place until well into Moses's adulthood and their journey in the Exodus. The law isn't there in Genesis. Genesis is all relationship. Much of Exodus in the beginning is relationship. The law comes as a tool to maintain relationship, but it doesn't precede relationship. It comes in as a tool to support relationship. And I think that's important when we think about Jesus coming later on and saying, I come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So even understanding where particular stories are located and the relationship they have to other books of the Bible can help amplify our understanding. So those loosely are the first 5 books of the Bible. Deuteronomy is also narrative, just told from a slightly different perspective, and Numbers is more, it's almost like a record format. So a lot of overlap just contained within those first 5 books. Then we come into the historical books, and the historical books, there's also a lot of narrative here. Joshua, who takes over from Moses, the judges who then assume the leadership of the people. So it's distributed, no longer located in Moses or Joshua and one individual leader, but it's distributed in a somewhat equitable way among these people who are judges. But leadership during this time was not only sort of governmental or legal, leadership, but also was priestly religious leadership. So the leader of the nation was also their spiritual leader as well as a political leader, which is something to keep in mind as we read these things. And again, immersing ourselves in their worldview, understanding even the ways in which they were organized and the ways that differs from the way we're organized helps us to be faithful in our study and interpretation of these texts. I'm going to skip over Ruth, because then after Judges, people want a king. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, named after the prophet Samuel, but Samuel was a kingmaker, if you will. He's a prophet, but he was the prophet who would anoint kings. And so 1st and 2nd Samuel are the stories of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. Now, the difference in 1st and 2nd here in the Old Testament is that the stories are so long, they wouldn't fit on an individual scroll. So the scrolls that so originally they were one story, because remember, these texts were first shared, not as written works, because most people were illiterate, and papyrus was not easy to come by, and they had to literally make paper out of papyrus leaves, and then put them on scrolls. And these scrolls were huge, long and thick. And so they divided them so that they would fit on 2 scrolls. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles were pretty much one story. And if you read them now, you can read them from one to the next, and they flow. Now there's a logical division between the two. So 1st Samuel is Saul and David, and 2nd Samuel primarily is Solomon. And then 1st and 2nd Kings are the kings who come after Solomon has died and his successors begin to reign. So there are logical divisions there, but the story also has a continuity. 1st and 2nd Chronicles overlaps with 1st and 2nd Kings. One is more narrative. Kings is more narrative. Chronicles is more, again, the record. So a lot of these that are the record are harder reads because it reads like a record book. It's like pulling out, when we had phone books readily available, you pull out the phone book and you read your phone book. Some people like that. It's not really interesting. But there are nuggets in there. And if you understand where those books and texts are in relationship to others, then it makes more sense. And you can refer to the story that is undergirding the record, if you will. And we also have these individual books in historical books named after individuals: Ruth, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. They're contained within the historical grouping because they're written in the time, or there's some connection, between Ruth, for instance, or with the events in one of these books, or just within the time frame of one of these books. And so we see that as the historical books. They're not necessarily, like, again, the Bible is not a history book, but there's history in the Bible. And these books in particular are laying out from more of a historical perspective than others. And that's why they're called the historical books in that grouping. There's the wisdom literature, and this is largely poetic literature, short wisdom sayings. So we have the book of Job. The book of Job is an allegory. So it's understood. The people at the time did not believe that there was an actual Job. These events happened exactly in the ways in which they're described. It's an allegory. It's an allegory, like a parable, like an extended metaphor, is a story that is told to give an explanation for something larger than itself. And so the book of Job is written to answer the question, why do bad things happen to good people? And that is, Job is the answer to that question. And it is an extended story. And so whether it is literally true or not didn't matter to the people at the time, to the original audience, but the fact that there's truth in it. And if you read the book of Job, from a perspective of someone who is wrestling with grief, you can enter into Job's wrestling and see the truth in that story that is beyond factual events, but the truth of what it means to experience loss, to lament that loss, to question that loss, to question the God who allows that loss, and the hope of restoration that occurs and wholeness that occurs in the book of Job. The Psalms, the hymn book of the Hebrew scriptures, longest book, 150 Psalms. They're not chapters. Everything else is chapter and verse. The Psalms are divisions because each one stands alone. There's certainly progression. There's certainly connection and relatedness. But again, each one, because they're often were used in worship, they stand alone. There's also overlap, and you can see where there are certain songs that you can tie back to the events that inspired them, and typically those events were related to King David, who wrote significant portion of the Psalms. He didn't write all of them. We don't know who wrote every single one. When you look in your Bible, it'll say of David for Psalms that we know that David authored. And so often you can go back to the historical book and see the story that's underneath the Psalm. Or sometimes the Psalms themselves, as I look at the lectionary Psalm for this coming Sunday, which is Psalm 99, it talks about Moses and Aaron and so it's in being used in worship to tell that story in a way, and typically they would have sung them. So you think about our hymns and how many of our hymns are based on biblical narratives and have been translated into music. And it's similar there. There are different types of psalms as well. So even within these divisions and these individual books, they can have different genres of literature, if you will, within the books themselves. Also, Job is both narrative, but also has a lot of poetry in there. A lot of the prophetic books that we'll get to in a second also have that same dichotomy. Proverbs are short wisdom sayings. In Proverbs, those verses can stand on their own. Again, there's some continuity, but they're short wisdom sayings. And so you're not reading them as a narrative. You're reading them understanding that this is wisdom being shared. There's some that are clearly grouped in a logical way and that should be read together, but a lot of them are individually presented. Ecclesiastes also has narrative and poetic forms, but it is a pessimistic book. I mean, there's some hope in there, but it is written, this is where you get all life is vanity, there's nothing new under the sun, nothing ever changes. It's written from a place of lament and hopelessness and despair. And I think sometimes we shy away from those texts in our study, but there's something about them being included that reminds us that these feelings, this perspective is valid, even if we don't want to stay there, that being there is still a faithful response to the conditions of our lives. And so Ecclesiastes helps us, I think, to do that. Song of Solomon, or sometimes called Song of Songs, it's a love story. It can be a little more explicit than you would expect in the Bible. The lectionary, I think maybe once in the 3-year cycle, has an entry from Song of Solomon, Song of Songs. It's unfortunate because in our puritanical influenced Christianity, we tend to shy away from conversations about faith and human sexuality, and yet there's an entire book in the Bible about that. It is about romantic love. There's talk of desire, and we shy away from it, and yet it is Holy Spirit inspired and contained within our Bible. And they made a decision hundreds of years ago that it needed to be included where other books were not, that it was authorized, it was meant to be part of the canon. The prophetic literature, when we think about prophets, common culture, what you see in the movies or TV, the prophet comes and tells you, buy a lottery ticket because you're going to win, or to, prognosticates about what's going to happen, that world is going to end on this date. And I mean, how many times have someone said it's all going to end on this date and we're still here? That's not really what prophecy means in terms of the biblical witness. Prophecy is about speaking on behalf of God in a given situation, and primarily speaking truth, God's truth, to persons of power, the leaders of nations. So prophets didn't go to the average Joe on the street, that the average person, average Sarah they encountered on the street, and say, woe is you, or this is what you need to repent. I mean, I grew up in Cleveland, and downtown Cleveland, when I was growing up, there was this gentleman who would be in Public Square. Cleveland has always had a downtown. A lot of cities don't have downtowns that are still population centers, or activity centers, I should say. Only recently, people really been living in downtown Cleveland, but there's always been some level of downtown activity, bustle and hustle, shopping and commerce and those kinds of things, businesses. And he would be in Public Square, where a lot of people would come and go because it's the center of everything. So public transportation comes through there. It divides east and west sides of Cleveland, which is significant in this region. And it just, a lot of people during the weekends, that is a hustle and bustle center of activity. And he would yell out to people, tell people they're going to hell. And I remember when I was in high school and I went to Beaumont School for Girls, and I had my jacket on. I had a varsity jacket. I didn't play sports, but I had a varsity jacket because it was cute. And I wanted it, and it was available to whoever. And so I had this jacket. I mean, I didn't have any varsity letters, but I had and it had Beaumont in big letters on the back. And so I was walking with a friend of mine, and I think we were actually headed to the public library. It was downtown, huge, beautiful, gorgeous, incredibly resource library, but it was in walking distance from Public Square. So we were walking down, but going across the street, and I heard him say, "Hey, Beaumont, you're going to hell." And that's the idea that a lot of people have of what is a prophet, that person who's out there spouting judgment to everyday people they don't know anything about. That's not the biblical witness. The biblical witness is that, because remember, the political leader was also the spiritual leader of the people. And so Isaiah and Micah and Zechariah and all would have been talking to those with power over the direction that the people were going in. Repentance, it means to turn. And the idea is that the people had turned away from God, away from God's direction, and needed to be redirected and called to repent, called to turn. And the prophet would tell that person or persons who were in power, who were shaping the direction of the people. And while we today tend to read these texts individually, we have to remember that culturally, in terms of their worldview, they would have had this identity of themselves as a people of faith, as a nation of faith. And the direction that they weren't going in their own individual direction, they were moving together. And so that call to turn was a call for the people, the fullness, the nation, to turn and go in the direction and turn in the direction of God and following God. And so that's that in terms of the prophetic language literature. There are major prophets and minor prophets. You may have heard that before. The difference between the two is the length of the books. So the short prophetic books are minor prophets. The long prophetic books are major prophets. Now, the length of the book does have some correspondence with the fullness of the ministry. So the fullest ministry that spans a couple hundred years, we're talking about Isaiah. And Isaiah is illustrative of another important point when we talk about authorship of these books. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go a deep dive into the authorship of the books. When you study individual books, you'll want to know, to the extent that we do know, who authored or who the book is attributed to. The book of Isaiah spans a longer time frame than an individual human being would have lived, let alone been serving as a prophet. So what does that mean? It means that the book of Isaiah can be divided into at least two distinct time periods, if not three, and two distinct, if not three, different authors, but yet it's called Isaiah because there's a thread of the prophecy of Isaiah that runs through it. So you have the identification of the condition and God speaking and saying you need to turn back. And you don't have that arise, shine, your light has come moment until the end, towards the end of the book. A lot of time spent in between there, where the condition is relatively the same, where the circumstances are relatively the same, and the response of the people is relatively the same. And so, because all of that harpens back to this original prophecy of Isaiah, who is the original messenger, it's all under the authorship of Isaiah, because it's more the authorship of the idea than the actual author. If I write a book today, even if it's based on, let's say, the teachings of Howard Thurman or the teachings of another great James Cone or someone else, rooted in there. If I write the book, I might cite their ideas. I might cite the specific ways in which they have influenced my thinking. But I'm going to claim ownership of my thoughts and of my writing, even if it's based and rooted in their original thoughts. That's the way we do things today. If I'm writing at that time and my ideas and what I'm conveying has another source of origin, I'm going to give that source not just a citation, but complete ownership. And so that's what we see in some of the naming here and the the pairing of, for instance, the book of Isaiah in particular. And we also will see that in the New Testament writings as well. Let's go to the New Testament. We have the Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. So the first 5 books of the New Testament kind of as a mirror of the Pentateuch, even though these are different, they're all narrative in nature. And there is overlap, but the overlap here comes in what we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that talk about the life and ministry of Jesus on earth. The Acts of the Apostle picks up when Jesus ascends into heaven, and is the life and ministry of the apostles when the leadership of the ministry has been delegated to them and they are continuing Jesus' earthly ministry. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered synoptic gospels. You may have heard that term before. And that means that they are closer in nature than John. Matthew and Luke use Mark, which was written first in about 68 AD, to write their gospels. Matthew and Luke also used another common source, which we do not have. It might have been destroyed, it might have been lost. We don't have it, but we can see from their writings that there was another common source that these two evangelists, they're called, or gospel writers, used in crafting their version of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And they each have their own material. There's a great deal of overlap between not only these 3, but even with the gospel according to John. But there's distinctiveness, and a lot of their distinctiveness comes from choices of what to include, but also comes from the ways in which they tell these common stories, the perspective, the vantage point. Remember, we talked about the intent of the author. Each author has a different audience. Each one has a different message they're trying to convey. Mark written first, trying to get the message out there. But again, 68 AD, we're talking decades after these events actually took place. Why did it take so long? One, early disciples thought Jesus was coming back any minute. There wasn't any need to record all this because Jesus is coming back. It wasn't until they realized that many of the first-hand eyewitnesses were passing on due to martyrdom or simply dying of natural causes of old age. Story needs to be written down to be shared with future generations. I think Luke and John, both in their gospels in some way, communicate that the reason that they were writing was to share that. Mark is getting the story down. It's the shortest of the gospels. It can be a little choppy in its presentation, but it can be read or presented, the entire gospel, in about an hour and a half. So if you think about, again, this story getting out there, oral tradition, someone can memorize it and share it in public spaces and get the word out rapidly. So it's spare. There's no birth narrative in Mark. We begin with Jesus in the Jordan River, and John the Baptist prepares the way. Jesus is in the Jordan. He's baptized. The voice and the dove all comes, and we're off. Jesus' earthly ministry begins. It ends in the same way. It's just, okay. And there are 2 separate endings from Mark. I'm not going to go into that because it's a whole nother setting and conversation about that. But just understand that this one is spare. It emphasizes the power, the immediacy of his ministry, of Jesus' ministry on earth. Matthew's writing primarily to say, this Messiah that we were promised, this is it. Jesus is the one. And so you see, going back to the Hebrew scriptures to fortify and to hearken and to make those connections for the audience that he is sharing this gospel with. His begins with the genealogy that shows that Jesus comes from the line of David, the king, that warrior conquering king who also was a man after God's own heart. And part of the promise of the Messiah is that he was going to come out of that line of David. And so Matthew is saying, this is the one we were promised. Here's proof. And we see that throughout Matthew's gospel, and just references into what that means, what the promise meant, and what that looks like in person and is fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. Luke has a particular, and Luke also goes back to the Messianic. I mean, they all actually go back to refer to the Hebrew scriptures, but it's a matter of perspective and what they're trying to convey in that message. Luke in particular is presenting Jesus as liberator, Jesus as bondage breaker, Jesus as being on the side of the oppressed and the marginalized, Jesus as as prophet, as restorer. Luke also writes the Acts of the Apostles, and originally that was one, the Gospel and Acts, and then separated for obvious reasons. The Gospel, Jesus is, it's centered around Jesus. Acts of the Apostles, those he's delegated the ministry to. And so from Luke is the only Gospel writer who then follows the early church. And so our understanding of the early church from a gospel writer's perspective comes from Luke. Luke, because he's concerned with showing Jesus' concern for the marginalized, the poor, the oppressed, amplifies the women who surround Jesus. He names more of them. He also children. He amplifies children. So there are those among them who tell stories. A lot of those particular stories are found in Luke. They're in all of them, but again, Luke is amplifying a particular lens. So Luke's gospel begins with the birth of Jesus. He does have a genealogy. His genealogy, though, flows through Mary, Matthew through Joseph, because we had to get back to David, but Luke's flows through Mary, but it goes back to creation. Luke is primarily writing to a Gentile audience. So he's going beyond that particular people to expand it to all people. That's why we have Acts in the day of Pentecost, and they all understand in every language and all of the diversity that is there. We find that from Luke's perspective. It's there in the other ones. It's just that each one, and all of them have this overlap, but there's this particular attention that you'll find in one gospel over another. And the choices that they make in terms of what to include and how they include it is informed by that intention. John was the last one written, and it was written in the 90s, 90 AD. Most of the early disciples gone, long gone. John is writing to a Christian community in some ways that is splintering. They're beginning to have factions who are, because now we're talking 60 years later, right? Folks are going, Jesus was great. He was a great man, but he wasn't really God. Come on. We hear that today, right? And John is writing his gospel to say, yes, he was. So John begins not with the birth of human baby Jesus, doesn't begin with the manger, doesn't even really delve into that. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus, fully human, fully divine. That is John's emphasis. And he is trying to convey that theological truth about Jesus to his audience. And so while we see so many of the other elements that we see in the other gospels there, we see John's gospel reads differently, just reads different. Like the language, it's more poetic, it's loftier, right? Shouldn't it be if we're proclaiming Jesus as God? So the subtle differences that, we might not think of, but the Son of Man that Matthew would, because that was a term often used for David, and also used for the Messiah, Son of Man. In John, it's Son of God, because he wants to emphasize and correct what is becoming to be known in the early Christian community as this faction and different way of thinking about Jesus. And so John is trying to convey, no, Jesus is both fully human, fully divine, and we can't lose sight of the implications of that for God's people. And that's the Gospels. And I know this is a lot, but you don't have to remember. You can watch this video again. Part of the reason that I go through this is so that when you get to the books or individual passage in a book and you hear some of this, you will have heard it before. So I don't expect anyone reading this to, become a biblical scholar and be able to recite this, but just to have an overall understanding of some of the considerations and the general organization and structure of the Bible. Because it is structured in a particular way. It's loosely chronological. But for instance, Mark was written before Matthew. At the time that the order was put together, the thought was that Matthew was written first. We found out later that Mark was written first, but no need to change the order of all of our Bibles for that, because the events would have occurred at the same time. But, just those kinds of differences. But in terms of chronological ordering, this next section was written much earlier than the first section. So the letters were written before the Gospels, and it makes sense when you think about it. Remember, I said the Gospels were written so that the story could continue to be told when they realized that the original eyewitnesses would no longer be around to tell it. The letters, though, were letters like we send letters or emails today, responding to life as it comes, right? And so the letters largely were from Paul and others responding to situations, sending a word of thanks, appreciation, gratitude to a community, introducing themselves, like Romans, for example. Paul's sending that letter to the church at Rome to introduce himself. Now, when we say the church at Rome or the church at Corinth and all the others, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, those were all written to churches, to larger faith communities, not to individuals, not even to individual households. Most of the time, these communities, people worshiped in their homes. They worshiped in small groups. But they would get together in large groupings, particularly for celebrations. And so the church in Rome may not have been, don't think of all the people in your community getting together for worship, like, all the like send it to the church at Cleveland. It wouldn't have been, there would have been far fewer people, because remember, this was a burgeoning, emerging movement at this time. So it would have been a significant number of people, but it wouldn't have been, hundreds of thousands, or in some larger megapolises, millions of people. It would have been a significant number. But they would have come together in these large groups, and the letters would have been read to the groups. It would have been sent by someone. You often will hear in a letter who is being sent by, because that person was introduced in order to validate them and justify them, almost like an endorsement of the letter writers, which gives credence to the letter coming from the original author. So those that I mentioned were written by Paul to those places, and each letter has a different purpose. In this case, in the New Testament, those first and seconds, which are all applied to letters, so the ones I mentioned, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, also letter to individual 1st and 2nd Timothy, and then individual letters written by individuals. First and second Peter, first, second, and third John. So Paul wrote to Timothy, Titus, Philemon. And so those are individual names. But we also have the names of James. James was the author of that letter. Peter was the author of those 2 letters. John, the author of 3 letters. Jude, the author of that letter. And I'll get to all these Johns we have in the New Testament in a moment. But those were individual letters, so wrote multiple letters. Now, they probably wrote many more letters than we have, but these are the ones that we have, and these are the ones that are included. Each letter has a different message. Letters were often sent to give thanks, to correct wrong teaching, to encourage a church in the midst of suffering or persecution in some way, or introduction. In terms of Paul's letters that I meant, and whether that was to individuals or to those communities. We don't know who wrote Hebrews. Hebrews reads almost like a theological treatise. It used to be a treatise of Paul. We don't believe it. Paul actually wrote it. James, Peter wrote their letters, and you can look at those individually. Now we have John, the gospel writer, John, the letter writer, and then John, the revelator for the book of Revelation. 3 Johns, probably not the same, almost certainly not the same. 1 John, maybe. The gospel writer and the letter writer are the same. More than likely, the letter writer might have been a disciple of the gospel writer and wrote the letters in the same tone of voice, from the same perspective. Remember, I talked about Isaiah and sort of the authorship of idea and thought. That's probably what's going on with these 3 distinct Johns. The book of Revelation is a prophetic book in the New Testament, but a particular type, apocalyptical. If you think about what movies will tell you about apocalypse and end times, it's really not about. I mean, there's some references to end times, but the book was written by John on the island of Patmos when he was in exile and in captivity, and he was sending these letters to the churches that he established, the 7 churches that are referenced in the book of Revelation. And he's sending these letters, and he has to send them through guards, those who are guarding him, to the churches that he wants to receive them. Now, you imagine that he wanted to communicate some things that he didn't want censored. He didn't want them to be thrown away, discarded. He wanted them to reach their source. So he wrote in code. So the people who receive the letter would understand his meaning, but the guards would probably look at him and say, I don't understand this gibberish. He's probably losing his mind because he's here in isolation. So, it's harmless. But the book of Revelation is hard to understand because it is written in code, so it could get through. But that means in some ways, we don't understand the code. But what happens is people don't read the book of Revelation because it's hard to read. And yet there is an incredible vision provided in the book of Revelation of the restoration of God's beloved community, of creation, of the garden, of nature, of heaven on earth as it is in heaven, where the fulfillment of the ministry of Jesus, where it comes to its fulfillment, like the work was done, the work of Jesus was done when he says it's finished, right? But the real hard lifted when he said it's finished. Although I think it wasn't really until he rose, but the hard part of it, when he says that. But it's fulfilled. It reaches its fulfillment, its completion in the book of Revelation, where that thing that God started in the garden in Genesis and said, it is good. And they're in harmony. And that's Genesis 2. right? Where they are before any serpent or anything comes in, before there's any separation, when they can just walk in the garden and they're naked and unashamed, and when they are able to be in the presence of God and God is walking among them, and they don't even address God by name because God's just there. And it's like, you don't have to, because God knows, and God's right before you. So you don't have to say God before you begin anything, because you're just that close in relationship. And all that gets broken up, and in Revelation comes back together. So we spend all this time reading and studying the Bible and going through these stories year after year and going through the pattern, and we never get to the happy. It's like watching, I used to, as a child, my father would take me and my friends to the movies. I always loved I still love the movies. My father loved the movies. My father would sit to the end. And when I say the end, I mean the end of the credits. We weren't leaving until the credits were done. Now that was a little long for me, although these days, when you have so many movies having those little nuggets embedded in the credits, I tend to stick around for the credits myself. Part and homage for my father, but also just because that's shifting culture, right? But we had my friend's father was trying to avoid the crowd leaving. Now, my father avoided the crowd because everybody would be gone by the time we would leave. But my friend's father we'd leave as soon as he sensed that it was about to end, and that we would know what the ending was, but before it actually ended. And so you're always leaving saying, I just spent all this time here, got emotionally invested, immersed in the story, and I miss the payoff. That climactic scene at the end where everything you think that they've been working towards and it's coming together. Miss that. So think about that when we avoid the book of Revelation. We read all this stuff and we so invested, but we avoid the payoff. I commend us to read it. Remember, it's a story, and if we don't know all the details, it's okay, because there's enough there in terms of the richness of worship and the imagery. And yes, I know some people get scared, but it's in the pages. It cannot hurt you. God doesn't want it to hurt you. It's crafting and shaping a vision of what can be. And I think there's something so hopeful, even amidst some of the imagery that's found in the book of Revelation. There's something so hopeful and magnificent in it. So I commend us to not avoid any part of it. It doesn't mean you can, if you don't understand, skim the parts that don't make sense. It's better to skim the parts that don't make sense now than avoid the parts that could bless you and lead to a deeper and more complete understanding. And so I end with, we are most faithful to the biblical witness when we study scripture in its proper context and authorial intent to gain an understanding of what it meant to the community to which it was originally written, so that we may reach the eternal truth that we can then apply to our lives today. That's an overview of the Bible. Here are some of the resources that you might want to engage in Bible study. A study Bible it will be sufficient for a lot of folks who want to gain a greater understanding of what they're reading in the Bible. It'll give you nuance, it'll give you context, it'll give you background that will be helpful. Commentaries give you a greater understanding and a comment on each text in more detail, and just depends on the type of commentary you get, how extensive that may be. But again, a single volume commentary for the average person is more than enough. Bible dictionaries, Bible encyclopedias will help you understand, give a Bible dictionary is more like an encyclopedia for those who are familiar with. So it's not just one or two lines of just meaning, it gives you context. Bible dictionaries and Bible encyclopedias are very similar in that they give you extended entries so that if you have a question about what was the Jordan River? Well, it'll give you, a nice entry with all the relevant information that you would need to know to apply to your study. And so you would look at it, it's organized not by chapter and verse, but it's organized by topic, as most dictionaries and encyclopedias are. You can find some of those resources online, but you have to be careful because some of them are outdated. Some of them are out of a particular lens. So I share here a couple of resources that I recommend, crosswalk.com and BibleStudyTools.com, that give you a nice variety of resources, some of which are not dated in a timely manner. In other words, they're not necessarily all that recent, but are still pretty relevant. So keeping that in mind. Having a Bible app on your smartphone or tablet, and these are just 3 that I mentioned, so that one of the things you can do is compare translations, because remember I was talking about the differences in translation, whether for ease of reading and meaning and word for word. One of the ways you can overcome that is by comparing translations, and it's really easy to do that with a Bible app or online resources like Crosswalk or Bible Study Tools. So I pray that this was helpful. If you have further questions about Bible study or further topics about Bible study that you would like me to cover, please feel free to put those in the comments. If you've learned something, let me know that. You can like the video or put it in the comments so that I know that this was helpful and you'd like to see more of this type of content. Until next time, remember to love God, love your neighbor, and love yourself. Until then, I'm Pastor Cheryl, and it is good